And we are live.
Good evening, beloved. I am Reverend Michael Russell, a graduate of the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago, the founding pastor of the Jubilee Faith Community in Country Club Hills, a founding member of the President of Soul, Southsiders Organizing for Unity and Liberation, and currently a national consultant and workshop facilitator serving in a specialized ministry capacity with Crossroads Anti-Racism Organizing and Training. I am a husband and life partner of Deborah, father of Justin, Chandra, and Evan, and grandfather of Gabriel and Ali. And it is those identities that I bring to this conversation this evening, as well as a passion for the work that we are going to be discussing and talking about. You know, last year represented a difficult time for a person of African-American descent. We slogged through a hellish landscape of the past administration. We watched Kamala Harris, a Black and Indian woman, be dragged through the mud during her run for the vice presidency. Whiten has slandered her character as if to say, how dare you think you deserve to run for office in our country? We are disproportionately impacted by the global pandemic on multiple fronts. Assaults on the Black body and the psyche continue to be common occurrences. We want to ask the question, and we have a marvelous and gifted speaker to answer. How do Black folk continue to access joy? How do we access it in community? How do we access it in protest? How do we access it in times like these? I introduce you to the number of identities I bring to this conversation, this task tonight, but tonight, I serve in the manner of John the Baptist. I herald an incredible voice that is coming our way this evening. The Reverend Dr. Waltrina N. Middleton is Community Renewal Society's 13th Executive Director, a passionate preacher and keynote speaker. They've shared a vision and message of faith, love, and justice in diverse settings across the world, including the World Council of Churches Forum on Peace and Justice in Trondheim, Norway, National Churches, the Carter Center, Samduit Proctor Conference, Churches Uniting in Christ Coalition of the Black Trade Unionists, Ecumenical Advocacy Days, and as a part of a United Nations delegation addressing U.S. drug policies and mass incarceration. Maintaining a commitment to human rights and advocacy on social justice activism, Reverend Middleton established Walk on Water Global Ministries, Diaspora Dialogues, and Cleveland Action, respectively, in response to systemic needs in their community and society at large. Cleveland Action is a bridge organization and a resource in solidarity with Black Lives Matter movement for Black Lives traveled with that movement traveled with the World Council of Churches to bear witness at the United Nations in Geneva, Switzerland on police brutality and state-sanctioned violence against Black and brown people in the United States. Diaspora Dialogue provided cultural immersion, a come and see experience linking students, organizers, and activists from the United States to their global counterparts in the occupied state of Palestine. Reverend Middleton's advocacy work engages marginalized communities from the Black Hills of South Dakota and Charleston, South Carolina, to Hebron, Palestine, and Sao Paulo, Brazil. Reverend Middleton was appointed as the third Associate Dean of the historic Andrew Rankin Memorial Chapel, with an emphasis on community building and expanding the chapel's social justice engagement beyond the campus. This was demonstrated in their co-leading Howard University students on a sojourn of healing to Charlottesville, Virginia, in response to the act of radicalized violence there that resulted in the loss of life by white supremacist groups. Reverend Middleton introduced inclusive language and an emphasis on womanism and radical hospitality at Rankin, creating safe spaces for LGBTQI students and insisting on more visible roles for women and LGBTQI preachers on the chapel's academic roster of speakers. Reverend Middleton fostered ecumenical and interfaith partnerships and dialogues and helped to expand the university's alternative spring break program to include the Lumbee Nation in Lumberton, North Carolina, and the Middle East. Honors bestowed upon Reverend Middleton include recognition by Rejuvenate Magazine's 40 Under 40 Professionals to Watch in Nonprofit Religious Sector, the Center for American Progress, 16 to Watch in 2016, and by the Jonathan M. Daniels Memorial Fellowship by the Episcopal Divinity School in support of research on the parallels between activism and lament in the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States and the anti-apartheid movement in Palestine. Reverend Middleton is the inaugural Jeremiah A. Wright Jr. Fellowship Scholar and one of the inaugural women Bill Lucy Jr. Social Justice and Globalization Fellows. Both received while matriculating as a Master of Divinity students at Chicago Theological Seminary, where they graduated with distinction. Their master's thesis explored reconciling a God of the oppressed, a look at sexual abuse, rape, incest, and other forms of sexual exploitation within the Black church. They earned a doctorate of ministry from the historic Colgate Rochester Crozier Divinity School of Rochester, New York. Dr. Middleton served in the national setting of the United Church of Christ for 6 years as its National Youth Minister for Youth Advocacy and Leadership Formation, and the Program Director for the denomination's National Youth Event, which brought together nearly 4,000 youth from across the country and 4 continents. And in that role, Reverend Middleton helped transform the youth conference, centering not only on faith and leadership, but also service and social justice. They challenged youth participants ages 13 to 18 to imagine themselves as the future today and not tomorrow. The program witnessed significant growth in attendance under their influence, challenged and influenced the national setting's involvement on issues including race and poverty, systemic violence, global human rights, advocacy issues, and the intersections of the LGBTQI rights and race movements. Dr. Middleton served on staff of the Trinity United Church of Christ, Chicago, and led efforts around earth justice, creation care, and its connection to urban centers and food deserts. Dr. Middleton is a poet, an activist, a vocalist, a social critic, a community organizer, and a healer, committed to actualizing the vision of a beloved community. Middleton holds fast to the principles of Ubuntu, which declares, I am because we are. We are because God is. I introduce to many of you and present to all of us this incredible speaker. The next words that you hear will come from the mouth of the Reverend Dr. Waltrina Middleton. And even though they might not be able to hear us, I want to let them know we are so glad to receive you. Come as you're willing and as you are. Thanks be to God.
Peace and blessings. Thank you, Reverend Russell. You're very gracious and kind, and I thank you all for such a warm welcome to Creator Mother and our ancestors that have ascended to the great cloud of witnesses. I say ashe and give thanks to all of the sponsors and partners. Thank you to Cherie Green and all of our students, President, board, faculty, and staff of LSTC, and to just everyone that contributed to making this gathering and this month-long celebration possible. I celebrate you and give thanks. I'm just really humbled to be here, especially in this moment of unrest and a great need to cry out in lamentation. Rage. Rage is the name of Harriet Tubman's gun. Rage is the uprising led by Denmark Vesey. Rage is Mamie Till opening the casket of her teenage son so the whole world could see his mutilated body. Rage is strange fruit. Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on its leaves and blood at its roots. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Rage is being sick and tired of being sick and tired. It is an uncontrollable, self-soothing rocking of back and forth. Rage is the incapacity to remember the names, all of the names. The trending hashtag virtual graveyard of names. Rage is having to say her name, having to say his name, naked in the streets to ignite outrage for the loss of Black and brown lives. Rage is street corners wrapped with teddy bears, flowers, candles, and t-shirts. with pictures and names of babies who have become ancestors too soon. How many balloons must we release? Rage is the separation of children at borders and forced hysterectomies, perpetuating a history of objectifying, violating, and experimenting on our bodies. Rage is poison flowing from your kitchen sink and pipelines running through your sacred land where your ancestors are buried. Rage is wading through the waters, trying to get to the other side of this nightmare that is inconvenienced by my truth-telling. Inconvenience because I will not choose their narratives of forgiveness, but insist on reconciliation and reparations. Rage is at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean with shackles still connected to stolen bones ripped from their native land. It does not matter how they got to the bottom of the ocean. Bones that got thrown over are bones that jumped in seeking freedom in death. Those bones be rage all the same. Rage is gentrification, a hostile, unapologetic, greedy, land-grabbing, disinheriting thief. Rage is a whisper that sings softly, steal away, steal away, steal away to freedom. Steal away home. I ain't got long to stay here. I ain't got long to stay here. Rage is not being able to hold the hand of your grandma as she takes her place among the great cloud of ancestors due to COVID-19. Rage is the cover-up, the unrepenting deception that cost thousands upon thousands their lives and in disproportionate measures in our communities. Rage is every footprint that made impressions in the streets declaring passionately, all Black and brown lives matter. And echoing the words of Asada, it is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love and support one another. We have nothing to lose but our chains. Rage is insisting on loving ourselves, our whole complete selves, and not being willing to lose sight of our humanity, our dignity, our holiness, our brilliance, our collective power. Rage is resistance, and rage is deep love made in the image of the divine. Rage is prayer, rage is faith, rage is hope. Rage is Black joy and the confidence in knowing your self-worth. I ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. Turn me around. Rage, in the words of Audre Lorde, is a response to racism. MLK said it is a righteous language spoken by the unheard. To be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious, says James Baldwin, is to be enraged almost all of the time. Rage is fighting for the right to preserve hugs, touch, and rituals that offer healing balms to our communities. Rage is having to choose between returning to work to pay rent, mortgage, and bills, or staying home to help your children navigate a virtual classroom. Rage is Eric Garner crying out, I can't breathe. Rage is George Floyd crying out for his dead mother with a foot on his neck. Rage is 7 shots in the back with your children in the back seat of the car. Rage is not knowing what happened to Sandra Bland or Sarah Lee Circle Bear. Rage is buying a burger for a self-proclaimed white supremacist after he murdered 9 innocent lives in a church. Rage is survival, the open wounds and trauma my body, spirit, and mind have the weight of carrying every day. Rage is what pulls me out of my bed and helps me to comb my hair and brush my teeth and put on deodorant and bathe my body and muster all of my energy and might to use the grief, lament, and pain to propel me forward, determined to redefine, reconstruct, and resist unrighteous and racist epitaph. Rage is a shared struggle. If you have come to help me, says Lila Watson, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is wrapped up with mine, then let us work together. Rage is the collective carrying of the pain, the anger, the hope, the prayers, the love, the truth-telling, the marching, the voting, the whispers, and the screams together. Rage is the power right and audacity to be angry and to hold it up unapologetically until all of us are free from the myriad ways oppression lives in the soils and produce strange fruit. Rage declares, I will be heard. Rage is my liberation. Rage is our freedom. Rage is our joy because it is your truth and it affirms that we are human too. I know we have gathered today to speak to the peculiar evidence of Black joy, so much so that we call it complicated. One may argue that the opposite of joy is rage. Rage is what we experience when we bear witness to the breach of security and the coup attempt at the United States Capitol, not because it was unprecedented. We have witnessed lynch mobs in America before, but let us be very clear, Black and brown citizens would not reach beyond the secured entrances of the Capitol, let alone reach the heart of its sacred dorm and on its floors, carrying our flags and our banners. We would have been disarmed by all and any means necessary. The clear disparities in how a violent mob of largely white nationalists are treated compared to the abuse and fatalities inflicted upon Black and brown demonstrators peacefully assembling to declare their lives matter and rejecting a systemic culture of racism. The disparities result in rage. This type of incitement that we saw last month resulted in 17-year-old Kyle Rittenhouse murdering innocent protesters in Wisconsin, demonstrating on behalf of Jacob Blake. This type of incitement resulted in the murders we saw in Charlottesville and in Charleston. The dehumanizing mistreatment of Anjanette Young of Chicago is egregious, and it forced to stand bare naked while pleading for decency in her own home. That is the rage I speak of. Before we can talk about Black joy, we must uncover the rage, the trauma, the brokenness, the ongoing resistance to being subjugated to nobodiness day in and day out. And yet there remains an audacity to embody Black joy. Black joy is our medicine. Black joy is our brush arbor, our secret spaces where we gather the sum of our humanity and affirm for ourselves, we matter, I matter, Black, brown, and indigenous lives matter. And if we don't procure our own joy, we will explode. That's what Langston Hughes tried to tell us. What happened to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? What happens to a dream deferred simply means what happens when we lose hope? What happens when we lose joy? What happens when we stop believing, when we stop dreaming? What happens when we succumb to this idea that we are incompetent, we are unworthy, we are failures, we are unloved, we are unforgivable, we are anything and everything but enough? The bones of our ancestors tell us that we are more than enough. Their scattered bones across this diaspora gives evidence to lamentations, yes, and joy. We do not have to choose. What is required is for us to be truth tellers and to show up in our truth unbowed. Hear what the ancestors have written for us. In the book of 2 Samuel, it introduced us to a courageous woman named Rizpah, the daughter of Ea. She was caught in the pipelines of politics, war, power, and a normalized culture of violence that claimed the lives of her 2 sons and their 5 stepbrothers. The scripture says, Rizpah took sackcloth and spread it out for herself on a rock. And from the beginning of the harvest till the rain poured down from the heavens on those bodies, she did not let the birds touch them by day or the wild animals touch them by night. Rizpah's 2 sons, along with the 5 young men from the lineage of Saul, were publicly executed as a supposed act of reconciliation by King David to make amends with the Gibeonites. Now, this occurred because the Gibeonites claimed Saul broke his covenant with them during his rule. David, now in ruling power, is seeking a way to find peace and solve the unrest in the nation. So he punishes Saul. David murders Saul's sons by nailing them to crosses and allowing their bodies to be exposed to the elements, the wild beasts and the vultures in the air. And David justifies the murders by suggesting he inquired of the law of the Lord via oracles and priests and prophets. And as a result, he was directed to shed the blood of the heirs of Saul. Now, the deaths in the public square were used as a tool of intimidation and maintaining power and control. And it seems the state-sanctioned terror was working as the bodies remained on the crosses, fully exposed to the elements and for wild animals to devour. No one spoke up. No one challenged the powers that be. They protected the status quo, except for a woman named Rizpah. Rizpah was a seemingly powerless concubine who was the mother of 2, but the guardian of all of the bodies hanging from that cross, or those crosses. And as Rizpah fights against the beasts in the field, she fights at the same time against the beasts in the palace. Those who ruled, those who decided they had power like God over the lives and the deaths of these young people, knowing that there is a pandemic and choosing to cover it up instead of telling the truth and finding ways to help the people live, not die. In the public forum, these young lives were executed, and their remains were left on public display as a dehumanizing act of disgrace and punishment. These human lives were hung upon crosses on a mountain and left to perish. They were innocent like a Rodney Reed, but were placed on death row anyhow. Boldly, Rizpah, a mother in anguish, sorrow, and rage, refused to be silent in the shadows as the state justified these barbaric acts against humanity. She spoke out not with words, but with her actions. She protested not with words, but with her vigilance. She resisted with a restlessness that kept vigil over the bodies night and day through good and bad weather and against all cultural protocols. Her rituals of resistance protested capital punishment and declared the lives of these who faced the death penalty, they mattered. She protested a culture of violence. She protested the disparities in the prison industrial complex. She protested the breach of justice that sentenced them to death. She understood that the death on those crosses reflected the death in her community, and she could not be silent. So she clothed herself in sackcloth, and she took the sackcloth and she placed it on the rock of the mountain, and she shielded not only the bodies of her 2 sons, but all 7 bodies that were executed. She resisted. She did not let any more dehumanizing harm come to those bodies. The people saw her, and they were convicted by her demonstrations. She stood in the public square alone, but her actions spoke louder than 1 million persons that make up an army. Her word reached the palace, the king, the state, the leaders, and dare I say, even to the communities of faith. Why are you silent amidst these executions? Why are you silent as these families decry these acts of injustice and harm against all of our humanities? Why are the sanctuaries silent amidst the suffering? Aren't you outraged with me? Stop telling me to march and protest peacefully. Stop lamenting youth rules of engagement when they just want to be free and heard and unshackled. When they just want to live, don't tell them to get into good trouble when they are being executed by bad cops, corrupt courts, and prejudiced policies. Did you not declare the word of God, which said, "For I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord. They are plans for good and not for disaster or to harm you, to give you a future and hope." How could she face the judgment of those walking by wanting to silence her? Girl, don't you know you are making it hard for the rest of us? Why don't you just pick up those sackcloth, put on some clothes, and stop making a scene? Those kids are dead and ain't nothing you can do is gonna bring them back. Why don't you just accept that this is the way things are for folks like us? Don't you know we are disinherited and powerless? Don't you know that we are poor, we are Black, we are brown, we are gay, we are queer, we are transgender, we are women, we are children? And so she looked at them and she responded, and she said, "We are enough." Rispa was not powerless. She was prophetic. Rispa appeared to be isolated, but she was imaginative, and she used her social isolation as a tool of protest. Rispa was out there on those rocks protesting night and day because she would not allow herself to be intimidated by the state or any opposition that tried to tell her that her lives and the lives of her children did not matter. Rispa's peculiar behavior draws attention to her and forces the palace to take action. She reminds us of the power of subversive protest. She looks to the ancient traditions of mourning by lamenting, of wailing by purging, and refusing to be consoled as an act of resistance. And she used all of these things as tools to rebuke injustice. Rispa spreads sackcloth for herself because she's alone in mourning. Yet she is determined to stay on the rock for as long as it takes. In fact, her name means a hot and fiery rock or stone. She is a pest that is getting on King David's nerve, and she refused to go away. She remains there. She did not allow anything to deter her movement. All this time, every day and night, this was a one-woman movement. But no, she was not alone because she stood upon the shoulders of the ancestors. And even those that may have watched her in the shadows, something was bubbling up inside saying, then maybe we are enough too. Rispa's behavior silently exposed the injustices of the palace of King David, used his position of power to separate children from families. He used his position to cause innocent lives to be harmed in the crossfire of war. And he hid behind these decrees in the palace and built walls. And cowardly lawmakers were too afraid to say, what you're doing is wrong. And we're going to say this type of leadership is not allowed. But a woman named Rispa sat before the nation in the palace, and she said, I will not go away. I will bear witness to this abuse of power. I will not hide or make politically correct my rage. I will not deny my humanity. And so she fought on with what she had. Who sits in the palace today? But more urgently and more importantly, who are the Rispas today? Who are the bold ones in the public square? Who are the resistors? The sackcloth and mourning honors the humanity of the 7 men and rejects the idea that they were criminal savages, less than human and unworthy of an honorable burial. It also sends a message to the community that these are our children, and the entire community is responsible for them. Everyone must weep and wail for them. We achieve radical Black joy as a collective. That Black joy collective shows up in our worship, in our singing, in our voting, in our marching, in our dancing, in our humor, in our cooking, in our lovemaking, in our writing, in our divine imagination, in our athleticism, in our politics, in our religiosity, in our diversity, in our ubiquitous presence all over the diaspora, in our resistance. Black joy shows up through and through, and our faith runs through it. Our light runs through it. Our power and our freedom runs through it. RISPA is a symbol of radical love, placing her conviction to do what is right before all else. She taught us how to sit in discomfort even when it seems like there is no hope or joy to give. Who is this woman with the audacity to hope and believe and keep the faith with not one or two, but 7 dead, rotting bodies over her head? What propels her to stand up and be the voice in the wilderness when it would have been easier to pack up her sackcloth and go? Instead, she positioned herself with the suffering, the rejected, the isolated, the dehumanized, the profiled, and the discriminated against. She sat with the tears, the anger, the questioning, the crying out on the rock. She sat with the stench of death because she knew that with the help and grace of God, she was enough. RISPA was at the foot of the crosses where blood flowed down and buzzards waited in the wind overhead. She was immersed in decomposing body parts stenching from the cross. She was fully exposed, visible, and subject to public scrutiny and condemnation for criticizing the status quo. Her actions made it hard for everyone else to escape the realities of these bodies hanging in the public square. No one else could walk by and pretend not to see what was taking place. Because if they pretended not to look up at those bodies on the crosses, they heard RISPA wailing. They heard RISPA crying out. They saw her moving back and forth, fighting off those buzzards and wild beasts. They could not ignore the woman at the foot of those crosses. We can glean from RISPA's womanist hermeneutical values. Undaunted, this grieving matriarch kept vigil, and she took on the agony and misery of the village. Her very presence is defiant as a woman keeping watch in a public space unaccompanied by a male counterpart. RISPA perhaps knew the king was watching her testimony. She perhaps knew he could hear her cries up there. She already lost her husband and her son. She was not going to run and hide now. She had nothing to lose, but everything to gain. What could she possibly have to gain to put herself at risk? I submit to you, it was beautiful, beautiful Black joy. This woman, a widow, a mourning mother, and now a prophetic voice, completely exposed the king and held her community accountable. And as a result, she not only brought shame upon the palace, but David removed the bodies of the 7 young men and buried them properly. Justice and reconciliation inspires joy, or is it joy that propels us to insist on justice and reconciliation? Where are the RISPAs for our murdered children with bodies left exposed to die in the streets like Michael Brown? Who will stand at the feet of their crosses to honor their humanity and bear witness to state-sanctioned murder of our youth? Who will reclaim their bones and honor their truths? Who will be outraged enough so that a generation will experience unspeakable joy, not tomorrow, but right now, today? RISPA has called us into the public square. She has taught us to reclaim the bones and ask the question, can these bones live? Here in the desert, here in these deserted places, here in the places where we lament, can these bones live? What flesh can we place on these bones? What breath of life can we breathe into these bones? What word can we speak to these bones so that they may say, I breathe, and not I can't breathe? RISPA didn't just protest and brave the elements for the dead. She was holding vigil for the living. Come out, she tells us. Come out from out of the shadows. Come down into this clearing and let us affirm our humanity. Now, yes, I know it's complicated, but I insist, come out of the shadows. I insist that we come together and we will poke holes in the darkness, and out of that will come the light. Alice Walker wrote, "We are the light in a time of darkness." The Hopi elders declared, "We are the ones we have been waiting for." Assata Shakur said, "It is our duty to fight for our freedom. We have nothing to lose but our chains." And Toni Morrison's protagonist, Baby Suggs, from her novel Beloved, said, "In this here place, we flesh that weeps and laughs, flesh that dances on bare feet in grass. Love it hard. Yes, I know they despise it. Yes, I know they will threaten to kill you and disinherit you. Yes, I know about the hate they give. But Baby Suggs insists, let the children come and laugh. Let the women come and cry. Let the grown man dance. In other words, let them live, because you are the prize. And no one can do it but you. You've got to love it. You love every part of you, your eyes, your skin, your private parts, your voice, your hair, your story, your beating heart. Love it. You've got to love it. You've got to do it. You. Because she says, you are the prize. And I'd say, you are the Black joy. You are more than enough. And we must be. For Sierra Minaj Carter Frazier and Dejanay Stanton, 2 trans women of color murdered right here in Chicago, we must be. For Breonna Taylor, for 7-year-old Ayanna Stanley Jones and Sandra Bland. When we look at our movements today and the resistors today, from Native American resistance of the pipelines to Black Lives Matters founded by 3 queer women, for pro-immigration movements, for pro-climate climate movement, for clean, accessible water for all. We are enough to break the cycles of oppression. We are enough to cultivate Black joy. Sojourner Truth one day just got up off the plantation and she declared for herself, she said, "I am a free woman because God said so." We are enough. We speak life. We declare that Black and brown lives matter. We declare that queer lives matter. We declare that immigrants at the border matter, the incarcerated, the returning citizen, the one on death row, the hungry, the poor, the tired, the stigmatized, the disinherited. We speak life and we declare that we matter. With your addictions and all of your struggles to stay clean, you matter. You are enough. There are rispers out here in these streets interceding for you, praying for you, holding down vigils of resistance for you so that you may bear witness to this beautiful Black joy. Who will declare that we will stand in the valley just as Rispa courageously did and fight with all we have, even if all we have is sackcloth and a rock. If all we have is our bearing witness, our truth-telling, and our resistance, who will go forth and face the elements with a Rispa as an advocate for others? 2 Corinthians says that we are pressed hard on every side, but we are not crushed, perplexed but not abandoned, struck down but not destroyed. We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus so that the life of God may also be revealed in our body. For we who are alive are always being given over to death for Christ's sake, so that Christ's life may be revealed in our mortal bodies. So then, death is at work in us, but life is at work in you. There is life at work in you. That is the source of a Rispa faith. That is the source of a Rispa resistance. This is the source of our movement. This is the source that allows us to insist on seeing life and joy over death, even as it surrounds us. Life is at work in you, and you must keep the faith. I know that It's lonely at times, discouraging at times, and you may feel misunderstood. I know the burden of feeling incomplete and insufficient, and it weighs down heavy on you, and it sags like a heavy load. I know the festering sore of feeling invisible. I know it's hard to feel fully affirmed when there seems like there are voices all around you saying that you're not good enough. I know the screams and cries that come in deep moans in the middle of the night, and not even your pillows can swallow them. Yes, it is complicated to find joy in this movement for Black lives. It is a movement and not a moment. This movement is like the breath that we breathe. It is essential to live, and we must embody the very thing we seek: life, and a life filled with joy, Black joy. And if that Black joy is Black queer joy, I am here for it in all of its beautiful and unapologetic manifestations. It is not a question, am I enough? But if it is your question today, as you wrestle with your discernment, with your call, your studies, your purpose, your identity, your faith, let me assure you of the good news, the celebration, and the gospel. You are more than enough. And I speak directly to the Black and brown bodies, albeit student, faculty, or staff. I know it's not always easy matriculating in spaces that was not conceived, designed, or imagined with you in mind. And where one time too often, you are the only one or one of a few in the space. I know it's not always easy walking unapologetically in your bold, beautiful Black brilliance, but I beg you, I appeal to you today. Do not waver from it. Do not bow. Do not run from it. Do not shrink. You do not journey alone. Look to your right and look to your left, even beyond what your eyes can see. And there you will find the outstretched arms and broad shoulders of our ancestors anchoring you, anchoring us. And in the words of Alice Walker in her poem, here it is: I commend you today. Try to think bigger than you ever have or had courage enough to do. That Blackness is not where whiteness wanders off to die, but that it is like the dark matter between stars and galaxies in the universe that ultimately holds it all together. 3 deep bows to a beautiful son and daughter. God, who is ever on the side of the oppressed. God, who has planted in our hearts, our spirit, and our prophetic imagination and creative spirit, a spirit of Black joy. We lift up this prayer to you today. Hear our prayer, oh God. Amen.
Thank you so much to Reverend Dr. Waltrina Middleton. That was beautiful, and I am still taking it in. We have a few minutes for questions. If folks have questions, please ask them either in the chat or the Q&A space, and we will ask questions. I do know that there is one question that I saw that came up during the session, and I will ask that one first. It says, what an interesting take on the prophet of God, David. He is the undisputed villain in this discourse, as is Joshua, King Solomon, and many other prophets of Jehovah. I want to know, why are they considered righteous friends of God?
I think that the story of Rispa itself and the bodies that she protected speaks to the very capacity for redemption and the capacity that we have to extend love and compassion and to affirm the humanity in all, and to be able to cry out and to expose injustices does not mean that we're discarding those that God loves and those that God calls God's own. I think that it's really important for us to be able to understand that love calls us to speak truth to power. And so to be an antagonist does not mean that you're an outcast. In fact, RISPA ministry was the complete opposite. It was to call, in the spirit of womanism, to call the community together as one, to not isolate or to harm or to separate any member of the community, but to bring us all to the center of the village. So I think that it can be both and. I think that one can be called out for the injustices. I think we saw the act of reconciliation where the king removed those bodies and gave them proper burial. The king could have left those bodies remaining there until there was nothing even, not even skeletal remains. So to be able to reconcile and recognize the act of injustice and to move towards a place of reconciliation inspires hope. It inspires hope for all of us.
Thank you. And another question says, how does the church help us to discern and sustain our source of joy in times like these?
I think one of the most beautiful lessons I've learned, especially joining and following the leadership of young activists across our country, is to recognize that the source and power of the church is not confined to a building. I showed up in some of those places wearing my collar, hoping to be a presence and a witness at the intersection of faith and justice. But what I realized is that I didn't bring the church there. I came to a sacred place that, just as Rispa had her rock, these young activists had their proverbial rocks all across this country. And that was their worship space. That was their church. That was their sacred clearing space. And I was inspired and I felt the presence of God being in community and in communion with those individuals. And even in some of those individuals that had, in some instances, not all, felt rejected by the church. And so I think to be able to go deep in our understanding of what church is, to redefine what church looks like and how we can experience church, I think that we'll be able to find joy. Because even while we were protesting, these folks were dancing, they were cooking for one another, they were loving on each other, they were comforting one another. They were housing each other, because some folks were homeless, some folks had lost their jobs, some folks had gotten kicked out of school, and they were pooling their resources and being community for one another. That was, for me, the experience of church. That was a source of joy during a period of unrest and lamentation. So challenging our perception of church and understanding that lamentation and joy can coexist.
Thank you. And another one says, in your work specifically at CRS, where do you find Black joy?
I will tell you that CRS is a 138-year-old organization, and historically led by predominantly white upper to middle to upper class folks. And I will not pretend that it's easy entering into this space as an executive director with all of my adjectives. And I will say that what I do in those spaces where I am challenged is to continue to show up as authentically as possible, continuing to show up prayerfully and owning and speaking my truth. And it is my hope and prayer that we are in spaces where we are welcome. And if we are not able to experience joy, that we can speak to what challenges that, or discern if that is where we want to be. And so each day when I enter into this workspace, I recognize the systemic and systematic challenges. I don't try to pretend them away, but I try to be authentic in speaking truth to power and being very authentic when challenging those systems, disrupting those systems, and reimagining how we can truly live into and achieve beloved community that's inclusive of all. And that's what I try to do every day. The mission of CRS is not only to eradicate racism and poverty, but to achieve beloved community. And it starts with me. It starts with me believing in myself, believing in inclusion, believing in Ubuntu, believing in this radical love, and challenging our systems from our board to our staff to our community and networks at large to hold us all, myself included, accountable for that.
Thank you so much again. And final final question is, in your sermon, you talked a bit about, or you alluded to, or talked about RISPA holding community accountable as being Black joy. Can you talk a little bit more about what it means for Black joy to be community accountability?
Oh, wow, there's so many ways. When we think of Black joy, even when we say Black Lives Matter, when we say all Black Lives Matter, I often speak about showing up in your full humanity, not removing any parts of your garment that defines who you are as a human being. And so when we say Black Lives Matter, who are we speaking of? You know, are we affirming the lives of queer folks, of transgender community members? Are we affirming the lives of persons who are differently able, you know, or persons who may have a different life experience or background from what is familiar to us? And how do we extend that welcome and hospitality? How do we affirm their humanity as well? And so accountability reminds me of Maya Angelou, who would not tolerate someone being in her house making a joke that was dehumanizing of someone's humanity in any way. She would say, you would have to leave. And as a community, as a village, we must not tolerate violence against one and say that it's tolerable or acceptable with one while we're saying we're fighting for the other. We must be committed in a collective struggle. So that means rejecting homophobia within the Black community and Brown community. It means rejecting sexism and elitism. It means when you see violence or harm and sexual violence in our churches, speaking out against it. You know, when we understand that there's one that is suffering, we as a collective cannot afford to look away. And so I think accountability is making sure that we are not silent when the disproportionate number of Black bodies that are harmed due to racialized and discriminatory violence are transgender Black women. And how do we march in the street and cry out the names of one, but we don't cry out the names of those who are invisibilized? Accountability is embracing one another in all of our diversity.
Thank you, thank you, thank you so much for entertaining our questions.
Thank you. Thank you
And I'll
for
turn.
allowing me to be in a space with you all. And thank you for your leadership and your vision, and blessings to all of their students. And thank you for inviting me.
Doctor, we want to thank you for your incredible work and your message and the time that you spent not only with us, but the time that you continue to spend at that intersection of lament and joy, and continuing to support and to advocate for joy to bear us through and to bear us into activism and into systemic and structural change. I just want to thank you for all that, as well as thank the sponsors of this event. I want to thank the Chicago chapter of the African Descent Lutheran Association, also known as ADLA, and the African Descent Strategy Team of the Metropolitan Chicago Synod of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, as well as the Anti-Racism Transformation Team of the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago. And I want to thank all of you who assembled this evening to give your attention and your support and just send love and joy towards these marvelous people who made this happen, including Cherie Green and our technical support person and all the people at LSTC. We wish you well. We pray for you, and we will stand with you as you stand at that intersection, continuing to advocate for just that beloved community. That beloved community that you not only speak eloquently of, but I suspect you see in your mind's eye. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Good night to you all. God bless you and be with you, and we will see you again.